This is a chronology of Malta's prehistory. This chronology was initially established based on variations in the ceramic repertoire found in the archaeological record and later confirmed by radiocarbon dates. It is believed that Malta was initially settled around 5000 BC by individuals who came from Sicily. This was determined by comparing the ceramic repertoires found in Malta with those in Sicily. The ceramics found that are associated with Malta's Gardelon phase show striking similarities with the Stentinello wares found in Sicily. It is during Malta's temple period, predominantly during the Gigantia phase of Malta's temple period, where we see a shift in Malta's focus from its connections with Sicily and the outside world to its focus on megalithic construction. And this culminates during the Targine phase. It is believed that during this period, Malta has a form of self imposed isolation where it develops its unique megalithic culture. During the Bronze Age, beginning with the Targine cemetery phase, we start to see changes in cultural practices on the island of Malta. Some of these changes include such things as cremation practices, the use of single graves versus the mass burial graves that took place during the temple period, some of the temples going into disrepair or being repurposed, as well as the first signs of metal being used. It is also during this early phase when Malta essentially reemerges as an active trading partner with the rest of the central Mediterranean world. A key debate within Maltese archaeology is the true nature of Malta's isolation during its temple period. A lot of the evidence for Malta's isolation centers around a sharp decline in obsidian recovered over time observed for each of Malta's temple period chronological phases, as well as a break in similarities in Maltese pottery from the pottery repertoires in Sicily and elsewhere. Malta begins to develop a distinct style of pottery that's not found anywhere else. In addition, it has unique monumental construction that can't be found anywhere else. And this ultimately comes to an end during the Bronze Age, where, as I mentioned before, we start seeing new cultural practices introduced into the island. However, this debate really focuses on the nature of trade and interaction between Malta and elsewhere. It is observed that throughout the central Mediterranean world, during the beginning of Malta's Gigantia phase, there is a disintegration of trade networks taking place everywhere. And communities throughout the central Mediterranean are beginning to focus internally and develop distinct pottery styles from one another. In addition, we also see in the case of the Aeolian Islands a sharp reduction in the number of settlements, which may explain why there is also a corresponding reduction in obsidian, as most of the obsidian that was coming into Malta was coming from the Aeolian Islands. But interestingly enough, the amount of flint that's imported during the temple period increases. As this slide shows, some of the various different imports during the different phases of prehistory, you could see that during the temple period, as represented by the initials TP, we still see obsidian even though in a reduced amount, but flint starts to be imported in larger quantities. We also have increasing amounts of greenstone axes being imported into uh, Malta, as well as ochre, Sicilian alabaster. And this would suggest that even though Malta was developing a unique culture different from the rest of the Mediterranean world, it still maintained at some level its trading partners elsewhere. This would challenge the notion that Malta's isolation was the result of it just being an island society, and suggest that it may be one that was basically self-imposed and brought about by having a regional disintegration in the trade networks of obsidian and other materials that was taking place, serving as a catalyst for Malta to start to focus inwardly. This slide shows some of the theoretical schools that have been used to try to interpret Malta's prehistory. I'm not going to go into each of these different theoretical backgrounds. I just want to show you the number of various different perspectives that have been used to debate the nature of Malta's unique cultural development during its temple period. Generally, the questions that I was specifically looking at was what was the nature of Malta's isolation and connectivity with the rest of the central Mediterranean? And specifically, I was looking at the role pottery played, if any, in Malta's prehistoric trade and interaction networks. The hypothesis that I started out with my research was that if the Maltese Islands were experiencing a form of isolation due to its distance from Sicily and elsewhere, and its insularity, or because of a cultural decision to take an internalized worldview or a combination of both, it would seem likely or logical that the pottery would not have played any significant role either as an item that was imported or exported in the archipelago's exchange relationships with other communities in the central Mediterranean. Therefore, I had two general aims to address this hypothesis. One, to determine the trace elemental composition for Maltese ceramics in order to identify potential clay sources accessed by ancient potters, and determine the role pottery played, if any, in Malta's trade and interaction networks with outside communities. Prior to my research, there has been some archaeometric studies done on Maltese ceramics, but none looked at the trace elemental composition of Maltese ceramics in comparison with other ceramic repertoires within the region for the Temple period, the early Neolithic, or the earlier Middle Bronze Age. So, in answering my question and testing my hypothesis, I essentially used a portable X-ray fluorescence device to analyze the ceramics that were excavated over various periods of time from Malta's archaeological record. And the premise of using X-ray fluorescence is based on the idea that clay sources can be distinguished from each other based on their minor and trace elemental compositions. Therefore, the trace elemental composition of pottery reflects the geochemical compositions of the clay sources that the ancient potters accessed in the production of their ceramic wares. This chart shows the number of artifacts that I analyzed for each of the archaeological sites that are listed here, and the numbers of artifacts for each of the chronological phases, and which chronological phases were represented by each of the archaeological sites. This is a map of Malta's geological clays. As you could see on this map, most of the blue clay formation uh, is located on Malta's northwestern section of the island. That means temple communities indicated by the numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6 would have had to traveled to those sections of the islands to get their clay sources for ceramic productions. One of the questions that gets asked whether or not there was a central ceramic production facility for all the temple communities, or did each of the temple communities have their own ceramic production workshops. One of the problems that we have with Maltese archaeology is we have not found any ceramic workshops in the archaeological record to answer that question. It is possible that the ceramics were made locally within each of the temple communities, or there could have been a centralized workshop that was servicing all the archaeological sites that you see listed here, as well as the other archaeological sites that were not included in this study. This is a picture of me analyzing a ceramic shard using the PXRF. As you can see, the ceramic shard sits on top of this device, and it is currently analyzing the ceramic shard and creating this graph, a spectral graph, that shows the elemental composition, the trace elemental composition of the ceramic shard.